Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Hitman, available on Netflix and starring Glenn Powell and Adria Arjona, directed by Richard Linklater. Like I said, available on Netflix, as it's a new release on there. Now, let's get straight into this, because this is a new movie that I've seen twice for this review. And I hear it's entertaining, but is it good is what the question is? Let's find out. This movie is inspired by a true story about a teacher slash hitman for the cops named Gary Johnson, played by Glenn Powell, who was in Top Gun Maverick, and other than some other Richard Linklater films, and a few roles in a minor role like in The Dark Knight Rises, for example, where he played a stockbroker in Gotham as he's in New Orleans, and he gets a promotion as a hardcore killer for the criminals after Jasper, who we'll meet in a second, and he has to disguise himself as different aliases. And Gary tells Jasper he's his replacement, as Jasper talks with Gary about aggressive acting and to not fuck it up. And the acting is good in this movie, even from one actor I do not like in general, but I'll get to that person when I get there. Gary meets a muscle man with a long hair in a restaurant of some kind, and he talks about killing someone, and he takes the money as his team Claudette and Phil overhear the conversation, and they send it to the police department, and they come in and arrest his ass, which is clever in the most fucked up way possible. And I didn't know how to feel about Glenn Powell when I saw him in Top Gun Maverick, despite I've seen him in Hidden Figures, for example, but I don't remember him in that movie as I vaguely remember that movie in general, and I have yet to see Anyone But You, but I'll get there one day, as that was after Top Gun. But he's really good in this role, and he's the best character in the movie, in my opinion. And his acting is tremendous, and director Richard Linklater can make him charismatic. Claudette and Phil drop Gary to his car as he goes to college, where he's a teacher there. And he listens to how his aliases should sound, and he meets with a big guy, and he says all pie is good pie, and meet with many, many different people as it finds its way to the police. For example, a teenage boy asking for his mother's death by hiring Gary and putting him in juvenile because he seems underage and seems like a punk in general. And we see many, many different cases of Gary pretending to be someone else and getting people in prison as he meets with his ex-wife Alicia on campus and have a talk about his life. And I get the impression she was a bad influence to him, but luckily we don't see her for the rest of the movie. And this movie is entertaining me from the start, when the movie starts, to when the credits roll at the end, as their conversations are a hell of a lot of fun. Gary, Claudette, Phil, and Jasper have a meeting with their boss, Sergeant Hank, so Jasper can go back on the field, as he was suspended in the beginning of the movie, as I was agreeing with Sergeant Hank about how Jasper was being an asshole in that scene. Well, we get back to Gary on his own. He looks at Madison Figueroa, I don't know if I said that right, please forgive me, Masters, played by Adria Arjona, and meets with her at a restaurant as Ron, and they decide to date as she feels safer with him more than her ex-husband, whom she'll just recently divorced, and we'll meet later in the film. And this is the actress I do not like in general. After seeing her in movies like Gods of Egypt, the Star Wars TV show Andor, and I reviewed her a couple of times in two very bad films, Pacific Rim Uprising and Morbius, but this is the best performance from her, in my opinion. And director Richard Linklater directs these two actors so well in this movie, as they have chemistry, and the cinematography is pretty good in this movie too. After Claudette, Phil, and Jasper overhear their conversation, Jasper knew they were hiring an amateur, and after they finish talking on the phone, they talk about not hanging out with Gary in general, and while he didn't hang up and neither did they, which was pretty funny in a dark way, Gary is hired as a redneck racist to kill someone, and he ends up in jail. Well, not Gary, but the racist ends up in jail, which serves him right, while Madison meets with Gary at a dog adoption in the park. And I really like them as a couple, but does she know his real identity? Because not quite yet, because we move on to the next scene as they eat and talk, and she doesn't believe he's a hitman, and they have a good time together, and they get her to a place they get to her place and sleep together and have sexual intercourse as the next day comes. And they wake up together, and the shots throughout the movie are very good. Gary meets up with a man and gets him arrested as a redhead, whom I swear to God looked a little bit like Tilda Swinton in a nerdy kind of way, as they take it to court, and Gary is on the speaking truth table, and we move on to Madison and Gary playing a game with a gun behind her back as he loses and she needs it for protection reasons. And he takes her to target practice at a gun range, and they go to a club. And why don't we get romantic comedies anymore, as they have romantic comedy on their hands? Madison's ex-husband Ray approaches Madison and Gary and tries to fight Gary, and he points a gun at Ray and tells him to apologize to her while he's drunk out of his damn mind. And they walk away, and they go to a restaurant as Jasper approaches them and makes the conversation pretty awkward while he's intruding, and Jasper is getting out takeout, and they play the game of 20 questions before and after Jasper comes and walks away. And this scene was awkward. Gary meets with Ray disguised as a different named Mike, as he wants him to kill his ex-wife, and Gary himself, who happens to be Madison, while they face different directions until Gary shows his face to Ray, who's a crazy motherfucker that runs like a wussy he is. And Gary calls Madison to stay in the house as he warns her about Ray wanting to kill her. And Gary tells Madison about the situation, and this scene was very intense in my opinion. Gary teaches his students how to do what he does, while Gary, Jasper, Claudette, and Phil have a meeting with Sergeant Hank about how Ray was killed, and Gary and Jasper go to a warehouse to tell Gary Madison must be the suspect, And Gary stops by Madison's house and asks her questions about if she killed Ray, while acting like an asshole about it. And they eventually calm down and hug it out and ask her if she killed him, and she says no, and she confesses on what he does, and he wanted to keep her out of prison, introducing himself as Gary, and she gets worked up about it and kicks him out of the house after Claudette calls him as Madison is suspect number one, and I'm scared for the couple at this point. Gary goes to Madison's house and pretends he's threatening her while he puts texts out saying to play along as the cops are after her, and one of the texts says to kick him out of the house once again, and she doesn't expose herself, as he saves her from doing so while Jasper believes they're bullshitting their way through the mess of Ray's death, so he barges into Madison's house figuring out Gary was up to something, and waits for him to get back home, and they celebrate with some wine while Madison poisons Jasper's drink until he dies, which was clever, and the way he died served him right, as he was an asshole from the start of this movie. While they become attracted to each other big time, and they get married and have a couple of kids, and as one of the kids asks how they did meet, and they pause and they tell him as the movie ends, and the climax was intense but clever, as this was an entertaining movie from start to finish, and this is one of the solid Richard Linklater films, and I'll explain why in a rating. I'll give this movie a 8.3 out of 10. The performances are very good in this movie, as Glenn Powell has charisma after this and Top Gun Maverick, amongst other things, and Adria Arjona is at her best performance, despite I don't like her in general, but she's very good in this movie as well, and director Richard Linklater directs these two actors so well in this movie, as it was entertaining me from start to finish, and it was a hell of a lot of fun. The cinematography was pretty good, as New Orleans looks great, as I've been there before once in my life, and this movie is pretty funny in a dark way, as Glenn Powell and Adria Arjona have chemistry together thanks to the directing by Richard Linklater. The shots are very good in this movie, and I really had a good, entertaining time with it. And would I watch this again? Yes, because it's a very good movie, and this is a solid recommendation, as it has pretty good performances, and director Richard Linklater has a good sense of having a good time directing actors who makes the movie fun. So I'd like to thank you guys for journeying with me with this whole Linklater review series, and until whenever, I'm not a hitman. I'm just weird.